Captain Eli Jansen sat in the dim cockpit of his ruined ship, the Vanguard. The once pristine vessel now looked like a hunk of scrap metal, floating aimlessly through the cold void of space. It had been days, no, maybe weeks, since the engine failure left them stranded. He glanced at the damaged display screen, but there was no change. The repair systems were fried, and the distress beacon was dead. His chances of survival? Slim. His chances of being rescued? Near zero. He was alone. Or so he thought. Eli turned his head, eyeing the strange, otherworldly woman who sat quietly in the corner of the cockpit. Lyra. She wasn't a part of his crew. She wasn't even human. She had been a passenger, part of a diplomatic mission between species, when the Vanguard had crashed. Eli hadn't been briefed on her background, and she hadn't said much since the accident. She was alien, beautiful, and had a strange, almost hypnotic quality to her. Her pale, glowing skin and delicate features almost seemed too perfect to be real. They hadn't spoken much. She didn't seem to care that the ship was falling apart around them. She simply sat there, her eyes often closed in quiet concentration, as if she was waiting for something. Eli had never met anyone like her before, and it made him uneasy. What was she really doing here? He shook his head. There were bigger problems at hand than worrying about a mysterious passenger. He stood up, stretching his stiff muscles, and moved to the ship's galley. Food supplies were running low. They had enough for a couple of days, maybe 3 if they stretched it out. That was assuming he didn't starve first. As he rummaged through the cabinets, he heard a soft voice behind him. "Captain." He turned to see Lyra standing in the doorway, her delicate form framed by the flickering light of the ship's emergency power. "Yes?" Eli asked, trying not to sound impatient. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice calm, almost otherworldly. He raised an eyebrow. "We've got nothing left to talk about." Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, Eli noticed a subtle change in her gaze. It was almost intense. "I require your assistance." He frowned, stepping toward her. "My assistance? What do you mean?" "I require nourishment," she said slowly, her words precise but strained. Eli blinked, confused. "Nourishment? I'm not exactly in a position to be your chef, lady. We're all out of rations." Lyra's eyes shifted, as though she was hesitating. Then her voice dropped lower, almost as if she was revealing a secret. "It's not food I need. It's something more." Eli stared at her, waiting for her to explain further. She didn't. "What are you talking about?" he asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "What do you need from me?" Lyra didn't answer at first. She stepped closer, her presence suddenly feeling overwhelming in the small room. She looked at him with those intense eyes, as though she were studying him. Then she reached out a slender hand, placing it gently on his wrist. Eli felt a strange pulse of warmth shoot through him, as though a current was passing between them. He pulled his hand back quickly, startled. "What was that?" She stepped back, her expression softening. "I need your nectar," she said quietly, almost embarrassed. "My nectar?" Eli repeated, his voice incredulous. "What the hell does that mean?" Lyra looked down, then back up at him, her eyes almost pleading. "Your blood. I need your blood." Eli froze. "You're kidding, right?" "No," she said, her voice steady, though there was an edge of desperation to it. "My species, the Aethar, we survive by absorbing life essence from others. From humans." Eli took a step back, his heart racing. "You want to drink my blood?" "It's not like that," she said quickly. "I don't consume it like your people consume food. I require it to live. It's the only way I can maintain my strength." Eli's mind raced. This was insane. She was asking him for his blood, for some kind of strange, alien need that he didn't understand. But what other choice did he have? She was the only other living being on this ship. If something happened to her, would he even have a chance of survival? For a long moment, Eli just stood there, staring at Lyra. She seemed fragile, almost like she was holding herself together by sheer will. He didn't know if he could trust her, but in the silence of space, with no one else around, what other choice did he have? "All right," Eli said, finally breaking the silence. "You get one chance. I'll help you, but this better not be some kind of alien trick." Lyra gave him a soft smile, almost as if she had known he would agree all along. "Thank you." And with that, the strange bond between them began, though neither of them knew how much it would change them both in the days to come. Days passed, and the situation grew more desperate. The Vanguard drifted silently through the void, its systems failing one by one. Eli had done what he could to keep the ship alive, but it was clear, without proper repairs, they were as good as dead. The only thing keeping him moving forward was Lyra. She wasn't like any alien Eli had ever read about. At first, he thought she was just another passenger on the doomed ship, but now he knew better. Her strange need for his blood, her mysterious behavior, and her almost hypnotic presence were more than he could ignore. The first time he had allowed her to drink from him, it had felt wrong, but not in the way he expected. Her touch was light, almost delicate, as if she were afraid of hurting him. He had winced when he felt the soft bite of her fangs, but it wasn't painful. In fact, it felt strangely calming, like a part of him was being pulled away and at the same time healed. Afterward, she had released him, her eyes clouded with a mixture of hunger and gratitude. I need more," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. Eli, exhausted and confused, had nodded. He didn't understand what was happening, but she was the only one who could keep the ship from dying, and he had nothing left to lose. In the days that followed, their arrangement became routine. He would offer his blood when she asked for it, and each time, she grew stronger, more vibrant. Her glowing skin seemed to shimmer even brighter, and her movements became smoother, more graceful. She was no longer the frail, quiet alien he had first met. But the strange thing was, Eli didn't mind. At least, not at first. It wasn't that he enjoyed it, but every time she fed from him, there was a strange connection that grew between them. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper. Her presence in his mind was like a whisper in the back of his head, soft, reassuring, but always there. One evening, as the ship drifted through the silence of space, Eli sat at the control panel, attempting to repair the navigation systems again. His hands were shaky from the constant blood loss, and his vision blurred every time he focused too hard on the screen. But he couldn't afford to stop. If they didn't get the systems back online, they would be stranded forever. "Eli," Lyra's voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see her standing in the doorway of the cockpit, her eyes glowing softly in the dim light. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with exhaustion. She stepped closer, her gaze soft and distant. "You're growing weak," she said quietly. "You must rest. You can't keep giving so much." "I'll be fine," Eli muttered, his mind focused on the controls. "I can't rest now. We need to fix this ship." Lyra shook her head. "If you continue to give your blood like this, you will die. I will not let that happen." Eli frowned, meeting her gaze. He could see the concern in her eyes, but he didn't trust it. She needed him, and maybe he needed her, but what if this was all some kind of trap? What if she was using him, slowly draining him until he was nothing more than a lifeless husk? But then again, he was the one who had agreed to it. He was the one who had let her feed, even though he didn't fully understand what it meant. He had made a choice, and now there was no going back. "Is there a way to stop this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "A way to make it stop without me dying?" Lyra hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. Then she stepped closer, her fingers gently brushing his arm. "There is a way," she said softly, "but it requires more than just your blood. It requires a bond." "A bond," Eli repeated, his confusion deepening. "A bond between us," she explained, her voice soft and measured. "The Aethar. We don't just take blood. We take essence, life force. It connects us, and in return, it allows us to share strength, knowledge, and abilities. You don't understand it fully yet, but I can help you." Eli felt a shiver run down his spine. This was more than just a blood exchange. This was something deeper, something that tied them together in a way he couldn't yet grasp. "What kind of bond are you talking about?" "The kind that will save both of us," she said quietly. "But you must trust me." Trust. It was a word Eli had used carefully throughout his life, especially in situations like this. How could he trust someone he barely knew, someone who fed off his blood to survive? It didn't make sense. But as he looked at her, he saw something he hadn't noticed before: vulnerability. She was just as trapped as he was, maybe even more so. "I don't know," Eli said, rubbing his face. "I don't know if I can trust you." Lyra's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked almost human, broken, fragile. "I need you, Eli, and you need me. We can help each other. We can survive. Together." The silence between them stretched on, thick with uncertainty and fear. But Eli knew that no matter what happened, they had no choice but to keep going, to keep fighting. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to survive this, together. Eli stared out the viewport of the Vanguard, his eyes tracing the distant stars. The silence of space was suffocating, and the ship, his only refuge, was slowly becoming a tomb. He had long since stopped trying to fix the ship's engines. They were too damaged, too far beyond repair. The only thing keeping him from complete despair was Lyra, the strange alien woman who, in her own way, had become his lifeline. But something was changing. With each passing day, the blood loss was taking its toll on Eli. He felt weaker, his mind foggier. The edges of his vision blurred whenever he tried to focus too long on anything. His heart raced, his pulse grew erratic, and the pain in his body seemed to multiply with each breath. Yet every time Lyra needed more of his blood, he gave it. She asked so little in return. Just a few moments of his time, a few drops of blood. But the cost to him was steep. Eli couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just his body that was weakening. It was his soul. The bond between them, whatever it was growing stronger, more demanding. It had started subtly. Dreams that weren't his, feelings that weren't his. But now, it was undeniable. Lyra's thoughts were beginning to slip into his mind. Sometimes, he would catch himself hearing her voice, even when she wasn't around. The thought of her, the feeling of her touch, lingered long after she had fed. And then, there were the strange visions, the ones where he wasn't sure if he was awake or asleep. He saw alien landscapes, fields of light and shadow. And sometimes, Lyra's face, her expression filled with both longing and fear. It was becoming harder to distinguish where Lyra ended and he began. One evening, as he lay in the cockpit, staring up at the cracked ceiling, Lyra approached him. Her footsteps were soft, almost ethereal, and for a moment, he almost didn't hear her. "You're growing weaker," she said, her voice full of concern, though it was clear she wasn't sure what to do about it. "You must stop giving so much, Eli." Eli blinked slowly, as though waking from a dream. He wasn't sure how long he'd been staring at the ceiling. Maybe hours, maybe days. "I can't stop," he whispered, his throat dry. "If I don't help you, we're both dead. You know that." Lyra sighed, her pale fingers brushing the side of his face gently. He felt her touch, warm and tender, and it made him want to forget everything. The pain, the exhaustion, the fear. It felt so easy to just give in to her, to let her take what she needed, and to let the connection between them grow. But he couldn't. He had to hold on. He had to remain himself. "I know," she said softly, sitting beside him on the floor of the cockpit. Her eyes were downcast, and for the first time, Eli saw a glimpse of vulnerability in her. It was a strange thing to see, considering how powerful and composed she always appeared. But this bond, it's not just taking your blood. It's taking more than that. And I'm afraid it's draining you in ways I didn't expect. Eli shifted uncomfortably, trying to sit up, but his body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His head swam, and his breath caught in his chest. He hated this feeling, this weakness, this helplessness. He was supposed to be the strong one, the leader. And yet here he was, dependent on a mysterious alien to survive. "What do you mean, draining me?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. Lyra turned to face him fully now, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't read. "The Aethar don't just take blood. We take life essence. It's how we survive, how we thrive. But it's more than just feeding. The bond, it's becoming more complex. It's not just physical. It's spiritual. And it's not just your blood I'm taking anymore. It's your life force. Your very will to live. It's why you're growing weaker." Eli's mind raced. He had known it couldn't be this simple. There was no way Lyra's feeding could only be a simple exchange. But hearing her explain it like this, so matter-of-factly, sent a chill down his spine. How much more of himself was he going to lose? "What happens if I don't give you what you need?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear growing inside him. "What happens if I stop?" Lyra's gaze softened, her lips parting as if to speak, but she hesitated. Finally, she spoke. "If you stop, I will die. But it will take time. The process is slow, but inevitable. Your blood is the only thing keeping me alive." Eli clenched his fists, his mind spinning. He couldn't stop now. If he did, she would die. And that, he realized, was something he couldn't bear. But what about him? Was he doomed to continue giving until he had nothing left? Was his life worth less than hers? "You don't have to do this," Lyra whispered, sensing his inner turmoil. "There is another way, but it will require trust and sacrifice." Eli looked at her, his head swimming from the exhaustion, the confusion, and the uncertainty. Trust, sacrifice. What else could he give? What could he possibly do to save both of them? "I don't know if I can do this anymore," he muttered, feeling his eyes growing heavy. "I don't know if I can keep giving." Lyra placed her hand gently on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "I'll help you, Eli. We will find a way. But we must be careful. This bond we share, it's dangerous. It could destroy us both." And for the first time in days, Eli felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way out of this after all. But whatever it was, it would require him to make a choice between his own survival and hers. Eli lay on the cold metal floor of the cockpit, staring at the ceiling, his breath shallow and uneven. The bond between him and Lyra was growing stronger, deeper, more complicated with each passing day. The physical weakness he felt from giving her his blood was nothing compared to the growing strain on his mind. Her presence lingered in his thoughts, like an echo in the back of his head. Every time she spoke, it was like her words weren't just coming from her mouth. They were inside him, inside his very thoughts. But despite everything, he couldn't stop. Lyra was right. If he stopped giving her what she needed, she would die. And somewhere deep inside, Eli knew he couldn't live with that. But what about his own survival? How much of himself would he lose before it was too late? The quiet hum of the ship's emergency systems was the only sound in the cockpit. The Vanguard was barely holding together, and the few remaining life support systems flickered like they were on the verge of failing. Eli had no illusions. They were both running out of time. The door to the cockpit slid open, and Lyra stepped inside. Her glowing skin bathed the room in a soft, ethereal light, her long hair floating around her like it was weightless. Despite the situation, Eli couldn't deny how mesmerizing she was. Every time she entered the room, it was as though the air itself changed, becoming charged with something he couldn't quite explain. She knelt beside him, her expression soft but filled with a deep sadness. "Eli," she said quietly, "I've been thinking." He turned his head to face her, trying to force himself to focus. About what? I've been thinking about the bond between us, she began, her voice steady, but carrying an undertone of worry. And I've realized something. I never wanted to make you feel like you're losing yourself, but I fear that's what's happening. The more you give, the more you lose, and I can't let that happen to you. Eli felt a tightness in his chest. What are you saying, Lyra? You want me to stop? Is that what you're asking? She shook her head quickly. No, not exactly. But there is another way. A way for us to both survive without you losing more of yourself. He frowned. What do you mean? Lyra looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. There's a ritual, a process that can shift the bond. It will change how we connect. It might even allow us to share the energy between us without draining you. But it's dangerous. It requires complete trust. And the risk is that it might not work. We might both die. Eli's heart skipped a beat. You're asking me to trust you, again, with my life. And you're telling me there's a chance it could kill us both. Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, Eli saw real fear in them. Yes, but it's the only way. If we don't do something soon, I'll continue to drain you, and eventually, you won't have enough strength to keep going. If you don't agree to this, I don't know what will happen to you. Eli closed his eyes, his head spinning. He had no choice but to trust her, didn't he? She was right. She was his only chance for survival. And somehow, the thought of her dying, of failing her, was unbearable. But could he really take the risk? Could he really put both of their lives on the line like this? I don't know if I can, Eli said finally, his voice strained with exhaustion. I don't know if I can risk it, Lyra. You're asking me to trust you in a way I can't fully understand, to give up whatever control I have left. Lyra's hand gently rested on his arm, her touch warm but filled with a quiet desperation. I'm not asking for control, Eli. I'm asking for a chance, for both of us. This bond between us, it's growing stronger. We can't keep going the way we are. I need you, and you need me. The weight of her words hung in the air between them, thick with emotion. Eli's thoughts raced. The part of him that was terrified wanted to say no, wanted to hold on to whatever scraps of his own self he had left. But another part of him, the part that had already given so much, that had already formed a connection with her, wanted to believe that there was a way out of this madness. I'll do it, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I'll trust you. I don't know if it will work, but I'll take the risk. Lyra's face softened, and a look of gratitude filled her eyes. Thank you, Eli. You won't regret this. I promise. Eli looked at her for a long moment, unsure if he was making the right choice. But there was no time to second-guess himself. The only thing that mattered now was survival. Lyra moved closer, her body warmth radiating through the cold ship. We must begin immediately. The ritual will help us shift the bond, but we'll need to be fully connected for it to work. Trust me, Eli. This is the only way we can both survive. Eli nodded, his pulse quickening. He didn't know what was going to happen, but he had made his choice. He had chosen to trust her. And now, they would both have to face the consequences of that decision. Eli stood on the cold, metal floor of the cockpit, his body aching and weak. The decision had been made, and now there was no turning back. He had agreed to trust Lyra, to take part in the ritual that might save them both. But the fear inside him had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger. The ship was silent except for the hum of the emergency systems. The lights flickered overhead as Lyra stood in front of him, her presence filling the small space. She looked calm, but Eli could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Even she was nervous. You're sure about this? Eli asked, his voice rough from days of stress and exhaustion. His heart hammered in his chest as he looked at her, searching her eyes for any sign of hesitation. You know what this could mean, right? We could both. Lyra nodded slowly, her glowing eyes filled with something Eli couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or sorrow. "I know," she said softly. "But this is the only way to stop you from fading away, to stop me from draining you. This bond between us, it's growing too strong. We have to change it, or it will destroy us both." Eli swallowed hard, his mind racing with thoughts of the dangers they faced. But as he looked at her, he couldn't help but feel a strange pull, something deep inside telling him that this was the right choice. This was the only chance they had. "I trust you," he said finally, though the words felt heavier than they should have. Lyra gave him a small, sad smile. "Thank you." She stepped closer, her body warm and comforting against the coldness of the ship. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his skin, and Eli's heart skipped a beat. She seemed so different from the alien she was, so human, so fragile in that moment. "Are you ready?" Lyra asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Eli nodded, his pulse quickening. He didn't know what the ritual would entail, but he knew it would be unlike anything he had ever experienced. Lyra had explained the basics, a way for them to share the life energy between them, to shift the bond that had been growing stronger with each passing day. But there was no telling what would happen once they began. "Just be gentle," Eli muttered, the words coming out in a strained whisper. Lyra's expression softened, and she nodded. "I will be. I promise." Without another word, she moved behind him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. Eli tensed slightly at her touch, a try to relax. He needed to trust her. He had no other choice. Lyra closed her eyes, and for a moment, everything was still. Then she began to chant in a language Eli couldn't understand. The words felt ancient, heavy with power. As she spoke, a soft glow surrounded her, and Eli felt a strange warmth spreading through his body, almost as if the very air around him was charged with energy. His mind was filled with images, visions of strange worlds, swirling stars, and flashes of bright light. And then there was Lyra's voice again, clearer now, stronger, as though it was coming from everywhere at once. Eli could feel the bond between them shifting, twisting in ways he couldn't comprehend. He felt Lyra's presence flood his mind, her thoughts and feelings mixing with his own. It was overwhelming, like standing at the edge of a vast ocean and feeling the waves crash over him. His body trembled, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps. Then he felt something else, something deep inside him, a pressure building, like a weight pushing down on his chest. It was as though his very essence was being pulled toward her, drawn into the connection between them. "Breathe, Eli," Lyra's voice echoed in his mind, soft but insistent. "Focus on me. Let go of your fear." Eli tried to obey, tried to calm his racing thoughts, but it was so hard. The connection was so strong now, and the energy swirling around them was making his head spin. But he couldn't stop. He needed this. They both needed it. A sharp pain suddenly shot through his chest, and Eli gasped, his body jerking. But Lyra's voice was there, guiding him, calming him, urging him to hold on. "It's working. Just a little longer." Eli could feel something changing inside him. The pressure was lifting, replaced by a deep, strange warmth that spread through his veins like fire. His head cleared, his breath steadied, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, he felt alive again. Strong, powerful. He opened his eyes to see Lyra's face inches from his own. Her eyes were wide, glowing with an intensity he had never seen before. Her breath was ragged, and her skin shimmered with an ethereal light, as though the ritual was taking all of her energy as well. "We did it," Lyra whispered, her voice full of relief. Eli could feel the bond between them now, strong, but not overwhelming. It was different, balanced. His own life force no longer felt like it was being drained away, but shared, connected. They had done it. Eli took a deep breath, finally feeling steady. The ritual had worked. They had shifted the bond. But as he looked at Lyra, he knew there was more to come. They had survived, yes, but for how long? "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Lyra smiled, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "We're in this together, Eli. We always will be." As they stood there, side by side, the ship's lights flickered back to full brightness. The emergency system stabilized, and for the first time in a long while, the Vanguard felt alive again. But Eli knew that whatever happened next, they had crossed a line together. And no matter how much they had changed the bond, they could never go back. The Vanguard hummed with a strange new energy. The ship's systems, which had once felt on the verge of collapse, now seemed more stable. The lights flickered less, the life support systems holding steady. But for Eli, it wasn't just the ship that had changed. It was something inside him, something deep. The ritual had worked. He could feel it. The bond between him and Lyra had shifted, become something new. Where before he had felt her draining his strength, now there was a sense of balance. His blood still pulsed through his veins, but the ache in his chest had faded. His thoughts were clearer. His body, while still weary, no longer felt like it was losing the battle. But as the hours passed, a new fear began to settle in. The ritual had worked, yes, but what had it cost? Eli rubbed his temples, feeling the strain from the intense connection. His mind still buzzed with Lyra's presence, but it was different now. It wasn't suffocating. Instead, it was like a gentle pull, a whisper in the back of his mind. Still, it was there. It never fully went away. Lyra had left him alone for a few hours, but now, as the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, Eli knew she was coming back. She was never far from him now. The door slid open, and Lyra stepped into the cockpit. Her skin glowed faintly in the dim light, and her eyes held a deep, searching look. "Eli," she said softly, her voice more fragile than usual. He turned to her, offering a weak smile. "I'm okay. Better. Really. I think the bond is holding. I don't feel as weak anymore." Lyra nodded, but there was something in her gaze that made Eli's stomach tighten. She was holding back something. He could see it in the way her eyes darted to the floor, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What's wrong?" Eli asked, his voice suddenly sharp with concern. "Lyra, you're not okay. I can feel it." She hesitated for a moment before walking over to him. She sat down beside him, her eyes never meeting his. "It's not you," she said quietly. "It's me." Eli's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Lyra took a deep breath, her voice growing weaker as she spoke. "The ritual, it didn't just change the bond between us. It changed me too. I can feel it now, what we've done. I've taken more than just your blood, Eli. The connection is growing stronger, but I think it's taking more from me than I realized." Eli frowned, his chest tightening. "What are you saying? What's happening to you?" Her eyes finally met his, and in them he saw fear. Fear like he had never seen before. "The bond. Eli, it's not just giving me life anymore. It's giving me more than I can handle. The ritual shifted everything, but it hasn't stopped the drain. My body, it's not meant for this. It's not meant to take so much." Eli stood up abruptly, the panic in his chest rising. "You're dying." Lyra didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, her gaze filled with sorrow. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, but it's not immediate. The process is slow, but it's happening. My body can't take the power of the bond. I've already taken too much from you, and now, the bond is draining me in return." Eli stepped back, his mind racing. "No, we can fix this. We can reverse the ritual. There has to be a way." Lyra shook her head slowly. "It's too late for that. The ritual can't be undone. The bond is permanent. The energy is too much for my body to handle." Her words hit Eli like a physical blow. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow. The fear was back. The terror of losing her, of everything they had fought for being in vain. He had trusted her. He had believed in the ritual. And now, it seemed like it was all going to fall apart. "I can't lose you, Lyra," Eli said, his voice breaking. "I can't." Lyra's hand reached out, her fingers gently brushing his cheek. "Eli, I don't want you to lose me either. But you have to understand, there is no perfect solution. The ritual saved us, but it didn't come without a price. The bond is too powerful, and we're both paying for it." Eli sank back into his seat, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had thought that by agreeing to the ritual, they had found a way to survive together. But now, it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "I can't let you die, Lyra," he said softly, his voice full of resolve. "I'll do anything. There has to be something we can do." Lyra's eyes glistened, but she smiled weakly. "I don't want you to do anything for me, Eli. You've already given me more than anyone should. We both have. Whatever happens now, we face it together." Eli closed his eyes, the hopelessness threatening to overwhelm him. But then, something else flickered inside him, a quiet determination. If there was a way to save her, he would find it, no matter the cost. "We're not done yet," he whispered, his voice steady despite the fear. "I'll find a way. I promise." Lyra's hand rested on his, and for a moment, they both sat in silence. The ship's lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, it felt like they were the only two souls in the vast, empty universe. But Eli knew that their battle was far from over. The silence between Eli and Lyra was heavy. It hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Eli had promised her he would find a way. But as he sat there, staring at Lyra, he felt a growing sense of helplessness. The bond between them had been changed, yes, but now it was clear there were consequences neither of them had fully understood. Lyra's health was deteriorating, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't fix it. The ritual had saved them, but it had also broken something inside her. It was like a clock ticking down, and Eli could feel the seconds slipping away. He had no more time to waste. But what could he do? "Eli," Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts. She was sitting beside him, her face pale, her glowing skin dimmer than before. "I don't want you to keep searching for a solution that doesn't exist. The bond is too strong. It's draining me, and it's killing me slowly." Eli clenched his fists, his heart pounding. "No, I can't just sit here and watch you die. There has to be something. There's always a way out." Lyra shook her head, her hair shimmering faintly as she looked at him with a mixture of sadness and affection. "You don't understand, Eli. There is no way out. I've already taken too much. I'm past the point of no return. The ritual is irreversible." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. He couldn't accept it. He had watched so many movies and read so many stories where the hero always found a way. He had to find a way. He wasn't going to lose her, not like this. "I don't care if the ritual is irreversible. We can figure it out. We can change it." Eli's voice was rising, desperate. Lyra reached out to him, her hand warm against his skin, calming him. "Eli, listen to me. You've done everything you can, and I've felt what the ritual has done to you too. It's taking from you too. If you keep trying to fix this, it will destroy both of us. You have to let it go." Eli wanted to scream. He wanted to shake her, to make her understand that he couldn't let her go, not like this. But deep down, a part of him knew that she was right. They had come too far. The bond between them was too strong, too dangerous. If they kept pushing against it, it would break them both. "Eli," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. "You asked me once if I would let you die for me. Now, I'm asking you, would you let me die for you?" The question hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Eli's throat tightened. He didn't want to lose her. But if the ritual was killing her, maybe it was the only way to keep her alive, by letting go of the bond that had tied them together so strongly. He looked at her, her glowing eyes staring back at him with a quiet acceptance, a peace he didn't feel. She was ready. But was he? Eli took a deep breath. The pain of the decision twisted in his chest, and for the first time, he wasn't sure what the right choice was. His instincts screamed at him to keep fighting, to keep looking for a solution. But Lyra was right. He couldn't keep risking everything. He couldn't let the bond destroy them both. With shaking hands, Eli reached for Lyra's hand, holding it tightly. "I can't lose you, Lyra," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But if this is what you want, if this is the only way for you to be free from this pain, then I'll do it. I'll let you go." Lyra's eyes softened, and a tear slid down her cheek. It wasn't fear or sadness that filled her expression, but gratitude. She had made her peace with the decision, but it wasn't easy. Eli could feel the weight of that gratitude in her touch, in the way she squeezed his hand. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me this choice." Eli nodded, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to overwhelm him. His heart was breaking, but in this moment, he knew it was the right choice. He couldn't keep holding on to something that would destroy them both. Lyra's body shimmered faintly as she closed her eyes. She took one last breath, the light around her dimming slowly, and then, like a fading star, she was gone. The bond between them, once so strong, vanished. It was as if she had never been there at all. The pain in Eli's chest was unbearable, but the relief came soon after, like a wave washing over him, clearing the way for him to breathe again. He stood there, alone in the cockpit of the Vanguard, feeling the vast emptiness of space all around him. Lyra was gone, but her memory, her presence, would stay with him forever. Eli knew he had made the right choice. He had saved her from the pain, from the agony of the bond. And though the loss was more than he could bear, he also knew one thing for certain. He would never forget her. He would carry her with him for as long as he lived. He wasn't sure what the future held. The Vanguard still needed repairs. There was still so much left to do. But as he looked out into the stars, he felt a new sense of resolve. Whatever came next, he would face it, because he knew that, no matter how far he went, Lyra's light would always guide him.